The sound of his voice was a physical force, a thunderclap that silenced the gentle clinking of cutlery and froze the air in our small dining room. "You can't even pay your own rent, Daniel. Look at you, a grown man dependent on his wife's family." My father-in-law, Robert, leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. The meal, a tense affair from the start, had finally shattered. I felt my wife, Sarah, shrink beside me, her gaze fixed on her untouched plate, a silent surrender that hurt more than his shouting. "A man provides," he spat, the words dripping with a venomous contempt I'd come to know too well. "He builds a foundation. He protects you. You're not man enough to provide for my daughter. You're a burden." My chest didn't burn with the fire of anger I expected. Instead, a cold, hollow humiliation spread through me, seeping into my bones. It was the shame of public failure, of having my deepest insecurities laid bare as dinner table entertainment. I looked at Sarah, pleading for a flicker of defense, a word of solidarity, but she remained a statue of quiet misery. In that moment, under the harsh glow of the dining room light, I wasn't just a man who had lost his job. I was a man being erased, declared obsolete and unworthy by the one person whose opinion she valued most. The insult wasn't just in the words, it was in the silence that followed, a silence that agreed with him. It was the sound of my own identity, the man I thought I was, cracking down the middle. The morning after the dinner, a fragile, hopeful part of me believed we could recover. I had spent hours drafting a business plan, a detailed proposal for a small logistics company. I believed in it with every fiber of my being. It was my ticket back to dignity, my proof that I was more than my recent unemployment. I presented the loan papers to Robert in his home office, my hands trembling slightly, my voice a careful, respectful plea. "I have a plan, Robert, a real one. I just need a start. I'll pay back every cent with interest." He took the folder, his eyes scanning the pages not with curiosity but with a critic's disdain. He didn't read for potential, he read for flaws. A long, tense minute passed. Then with a dismissive snort, he tossed the papers back at me. They fluttered to the floor, a chaotic snowfall of my broken hopes. "You'll get no help from me," he declared, his voice flat and final. "I don't fund pipe dreams. My daughter needs a real man, not a gambler." The words were a physical blow. I knelt, gathering the scattered pages, my vision blurring. As I walked out of his office, his low, derisive laughter followed me into the hallway. It wasn't just a rejection, it was a condemnation. That sound, the sound of his laughter, was the sound of the final bridge between us not just burning, but being deliberately, joyfully blown to pieces. There was no coming back from this. He had not only refused to help, he had made it clear he enjoyed watching me fall. 2 days later, the sky opened up as if mourning the end of my marriage. The rain wasn't gentle. It was a relentless, cold downpour that soaked through my jacket in seconds. I was carrying the last box of my belongings to my beat-up car parked at the curb. The box was light, filled with books and old photos, but it felt like it contained the weight of my entire former life. Our home, the one I'd shared with Sarah, stood dark and silent behind me. Just as I reached the car, I saw it, a shift in the light, a movement in the living room window. Her shadow appeared behind the curtain, a ghostly silhouette against the warm glow inside. I stopped, my heart hammering against my ribs, a foolish, desperate hope flaring inside me. Maybe she would come out, maybe she would say stop. Maybe she would choose me. The shadow remained motionless, a silent witness to my exile. She didn't open the door, she didn't call my name, she just watched. The finality of that silent observation was more devastating than any shouted argument. I was being witnessed, but not seen. I was a problem being removed. The cold rain mixed with the hot tears on my face, and I whispered into the wet, indifferent night, my voice a raw, broken thing. "One day, this pain will have a purpose. This humiliation will mean something." It was a vow, not a plea. A promise forged in the cold furnace of that moment, a seed of defiance planted in the deepest, most wounded part of my soul. My new world was a basement apartment a few blocks from the industrial docks, a space that smelled perpetually of damp concrete and distant brine. It was a single, long room with a low ceiling where I had to stoop in certain spots. A single, bare 60-watt light bulb hung from a wire, casting a sickly yellow glow that did little to push back the shadows. Against one damp wall sat a broken desk I'd salvaged from the curb, one leg propped up with a stack of old magazines. On it rested my most vital possession, a 5-year-old laptop with a cracked screen that flickered ominously if you moved it the wrong way. This was my kingdom of rock bottom. The floor was cold concrete, and the single window at street level offered a view of passing ankles and discarded trash. At night, I could hear the groaning horns of freight ships and the scuttling of things I didn't want to identify. But in the profound silence of that space, something quiet and determined began to stir within me. The humiliation, the rain, the closed door, they were all here with me, but they were no longer weapons used against me. They were my fuel. This basement, with its one light bulb and its cracked screen, was not a prison. It was a forge. It was the blank, rock-bottom page on which I would rewrite my story. It was enough to start. It had to be. My life fractured into two starkly different realities, a brutal Jekyll and Hyde existence that tested the very limits of my body and spirit. By day, I became a ghost of my former self, a nameless body in a high-visibility vest loading and unloading endless containers at the docks. The work was pure physical punishment. My muscles screamed in protest, my hands grew raw and calloused, and my back ached with a deep, persistent throb that became the soundtrack to my daylight hours. I would come home to the basement each evening, my body broken and reeking of sweat and sea salt, collapsing onto the thin mattress on the floor. But as the sun went down, a different man emerged. After a cold shower and a meal of cheap noodles, I would sit at the wobbly desk, fire up the flickering laptop, and begin my real work. The world of code and business strategy, which I had once dabbled in, became my obsession. I devoured every free online tutorial, every archived lecture from prestigious universities, every ebook on logistics and supply chain management I could find. While my body was being systematically broken down, my mind was being meticulously, fiercely rebuilt. It was a grueling, painful transformation. The fatigue was a living entity, a heavy blanket trying to smother my ambition. But the memory of Robert's laughter, the image of Sarah's shadow behind the curtain, were whips that kept me going. My body was the price of admission, but my mind was building the escape route. For months, every spare moment and every ounce of my mental energy was poured into my first project, a simple, streamlined app for local independent truckers to find and manage loads. It was my masterpiece, my answer to every insult, the physical proof of my worth. The night I finally uploaded it to the App Store, my heart was a drum of triumph. I stayed up all night, refreshing the page, waiting for the first download, the first sign that I was on my way. For 3 days, there was nothing. Then, on the 4th day, an email arrived from the platform. App suspension, critical system error. I frantically opened the developer console on my laptop. The screen was a mess of red text and error codes. A fundamental flaw in my code, something a more experienced developer would have caught, had caused the entire system to crash under the slightest load. It wasn't just a bug, it was a catastrophic failure. I stared at the screen, the flickering lines of failed code reflecting in my wide, disbelieving eyes. My fists clenched on the desk, trembling with a volatile mix of rage and despair. The voice of doubt, the one I had been fighting so hard, whispered from the depths of my exhaustion. Maybe they were right. Maybe this is all you are. A failure. The weight of the past months, the back-breaking labor, the isolation, the cold loneliness of the basement, threatened to crush me completely. I put my head in my hands, on the verge of surrendering to the darkness. But then, a spark. A stubborn, defiant, and deeply human part of me, a part that had been forged in the rain outside my old home, refused to quit. It was a small flame, but it was enough to keep me in the chair, staring at the failure and deciding to understand it. In the deep, hollow silence that followed the failure, I scrolled through online forums looking for answers, for anything to keep the despair at bay. That's when I found it typed out in a simple font on a minimalist blog. A lion doesn't turn around when a small dog barks. The sentence hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was so simple, yet it reframed everything. Robert's insults, the laughter, the rejection, they were just noise. The barking of small dogs. A lion, a creature of true strength and purpose, didn't waste its energy on them. It kept its eyes on the horizon, on its prey, on its survival. I wasn't a failure. I was a lion who had stumbled. I wrote the quote down on a piece of paper and taped it to the damp wall right above my bed, where it was the first thing I saw every morning and the last thing I saw at night. That simple phrase became my anchor, my mantra, my shield. That night, something fundamental shifted inside me. The self-pity that had been a constant, low-grade companion evaporated, burned away by a new, hotter fire. I stopped feeling sorry for my circumstances and started strategizing my way out of them. I dissected the failed app line by line, not as a monument to my incompetence, but as the most valuable textbook I could have asked for. I stopped being a victim of my past and became the architect of my future. The fire in my chest was no longer one of humiliation. It was the focused, intense heat of a forge, and I was the metal being tempered, being made stronger. To make ends meet after pouring my savings into the failed app, I took a part-time job delivering food for a local cafe. It was humbling, cycling through the city with an insulated backpack, but it kept the lights on. The cafe was a small, artsy place frequented by an older, eclectic crowd. One regular was a man named Arthur, who always sat in the same corner with a book and a pot of tea. He had kind eyes and a calm, observant presence. One afternoon, during a lull between deliveries, I was sketching out a new, more robust system architecture on a stack of napkins, my brow furrowed in concentration. I didn't notice Arthur standing beside me until he spoke. "That's an interesting node structure for a logistics chain," he said, his voice a quiet rumble. I jumped, instinctively covering my scribbles. He smiled. "Don't worry, son, I'm retired. Used to run a shipping company back in the day." He pointed to a specific part of my sketch. "That bottleneck there will kill you under peak load." We started talking. He asked pointed, insightful questions that no tutorial ever had. He didn't offer praise, he offered critique, but it was constructive, born of real experience. As I was leaving for a delivery, he stopped me. "You've got ideas, kid. Real raw talent," he said, his gaze steady. "But ideas are a dime a dozen. Now you need to find the discipline to match." Those words, "the discipline to match," became my new mission. Arthur became my unofficial mentor, his quiet guidance a lighthouse in the fog of my ambition. Bolstered by Arthur's advice and a newly resilient business plan, I spent 3 months refining my concept. This wasn't just an app. It was a full, cloud-based logistics tracker designed for the specific, overlooked needs of small to mid-size port-side businesses. I saved every spare penny, bought a cheap, but presentable, suit and booked meetings. The first investor spent the entire meeting on his phone. The second told me my market was too niche. The third said I lacked experience. The rejections piled up, each one a small cut. The fourth, fifth, and sixth meetings were a blur of polite, dismissive smiles. The seventh investor kept me waiting for an hour only to tell me he wasn't interested in dockworkers with big dreams. The eighth and ninth were variations on the same theme. By the 10th and final meeting, the hope in my heart was a guttering candle. I walked into the office of a notoriously tough, old-school investor named Ms. Chen, my spirit already braced for the final blow. I gave my pitch, my voice hoarse from repetition and nerves. She listened in complete silence, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she stared at me for a long, uncomfortable minute. "It's risky," she finally said, her voice like gravel. "The market is volatile, your margins are thin." I nodded, ready to gather my things. Then she added, "But I like your grit. You've got fire in your eyes and you know the industry from the ground up, literally. That's something you can't teach." She slid a term sheet across the table. That single, unexpected yes after a symphony of no's was more than just funding. It was validation. It was oxygen to a dying flame. It changed everything. The injection of capital from Ms. Chen was like a starter's pistol. I worked with a ferocious intensity I didn't know I possessed. I hired a small, brilliant freelance coder to handle the elements beyond my expertise, and together, we built the platform. I personally visited every small shipping firm, every independent warehouse manager I had met during my time at the docks. I spoke their language, understood their frustrations because they had been my own. The first company to sign on was a struggling family-run operation, much like the one I had envisioned helping from the start. When their first payment cleared in our account, I didn't celebrate. I just stared at the notification on my laptop screen, sitting in the same basement but feeling a world away. Then another signed, and another. Word began to spread that this new system, Reed Logistics, actually worked. It was efficient, intuitive, and built by someone who got it. I didn't sleep for 36 hours that first week of real operations, troubleshooting, onboarding, and managing the sudden, beautiful influx of demand. I existed on coffee and a relentless drive. But as I finally collapsed onto my bed, my body humming with exhaustion, a slow, deep smile spread across my face. I was bone tired, but it was a different kind of fatigue. It wasn't the exhaustion of hopeless labor. It was the satisfying weariness of creation. These sleepless nights, this overwhelming pressure, they were mine. I had chosen this path, built this reality, and for the first time in years, I was the one steering the ship through the storm. The momentum, once started, became a tidal wave. Within 6 months of that first payment, our revenue had not just increased, it had tripled. The niche I had identified was starved for a modern solution, and we were the only ones offering it. I moved out of the basement and into a small, clean, one-bedroom apartment. It wasn't luxurious, but the ceiling was high, the windows let in light, and it didn't smell of damp. The most significant day was when I hired my first official employee, a young, hungry graduate named Leo. The moment I handed him his contract and he signed it, I looked at my own hands, the same hands that had gripped rough cargo, that had trembled holding failed loan papers, that had been calloused and broken. Now, they were the hands that signed paychecks. They were the hands that provided a livelihood for someone else. It was a surreal, powerful circle that closed with a quiet, profound click in my soul. I wasn't just building a company. I was building a small ecosystem of stability, something I had been violently stripped of. Every signature on a paycheck was a silent rebuttal to the accusation that I could not provide. The power wasn't in the money. It was in the act of giving, of enabling, of building someone else up instead of tearing them down. Success, I found, was a quiet song, not a loud parade. I didn't make announcements. I didn't seek the spotlight. I simply focused on the work, on building something solid and real. So it was a complete surprise when a business journalist from an online magazine tracked me down. She had heard whispers of a dockworker CEO who was disrupting local logistics. She asked for an interview, and after some hesitation, I agreed on the condition that the focus was on the business, not a sob story. The article came out a week later. The headline was bold. From homeless to CEO, Daniel Reed's unlikely logistics empire. It detailed my fall, the basement, the failed app, and the eventual success. Colleagues and clients sent congratulatory emails, stunned by the backstory they never knew. But I didn't forward the link. I didn't post it on social media. I read it once, alone in my new apartment, and then closed the browser. There was no satisfaction in the public revelation of my past pain. The true victory was in the quiet of my own mind, in the knowledge that I had climbed out of the abyss. The headline felt like it belonged to another person, a character in a story. My real success was the peace I felt when I looked in the mirror each morning, the quiet confidence that had replaced the hollow shame. Success felt better when it was quiet, when it was a secret strength known only to me. It was past 11 on a Tuesday night. I was reviewing quarterly reports, the city a tapestry of lights outside my apartment window. My phone, set to silent, vibrated across the wooden desk with an insistent, unknown rhythm. Usually I'd ignore it, but something, a gut-deep pull, made me answer. "Hello," a professional, slightly weary female voice replied. "Am I speaking with Daniel Reed?" "Yes, this is he." "Mr. Reed, this is Nurse Wilkins from County General Hospital. We have a Robert Miller here. He's listed you as his emergency contact and financial guarantor." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The name landed like a physical punch to my chest, knocking the air from my lungs. The room, once a sanctuary of my success, suddenly felt small and suffocating. Robert, my father-in-law, the architect of my exile. Why me?" I managed to stammer, my mind reeling. Why would he list me? Was it a final, twisted joke? The nurse's voice was gentle but firm. "Sir, his kidneys are in acute failure. He's conscious but very ill. We need to begin immediate dialysis, and we require financial authorization for the treatment plan." The words, financial authorization, echoed in the silence. The universe, in its vast, incomprehensible design, had just whispered my name. It had placed the man who once held all the power over my life, now desperately vulnerable, directly into my hands. The phone felt heavy, charged with the weight of a cosmic irony too profound to ignore. After hanging up the phone, a profound, heavy silence descended upon my apartment. It was a silence filled with ghosts. I could hear the echo of Robert's voice from 2 years ago. "You're not man enough to provide." I could see the disdain in his eyes as he tossed my loan papers to the floor. I could feel the cold rain on my face as I carried my last box away. And now, a nurse was telling me that this same man needed my provision, my authorization, for the very thing that would keep him alive. My breath caught in my throat, a tangled knot of old hurt and shocking new reality. I walked to the window, staring out at the glittering city without really seeing it. Why had he put my name down? Was it a gesture of desperation, a lack of any other option? Or was it, in some deep, unacknowledged part of him, a silent, belated admission that I was, in fact, the man he had refused to see? The question, why me, wasn't just about logistics. It was a cry from the wounded part of my soul. The nurse's clinical explanation, "His kidneys are failing," was a stark, biological fact that cut through years of emotional complexity. In that sterile hospital room, all the power dynamics, all the pride and prejudice, were rendered irrelevant by the simple, brutal fact of mortality. The universe had not just whispered. It had presented me with a test I never could have imagined. A test of the very manhood he had once so publicly questioned. The drive to the hospital was a journey through a tunnel of my own past. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white as I navigated the familiar streets, each turn pulling me closer to a ghost I had tried to leave behind. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, my grip tight not from the traffic, but from the storm of memories replaying in my mind like a tragic film. I saw his face, smug and condescending across the dinner table. I heard the sharp, dismissive laughter that had followed me out of his house. I felt the cold, penetrating soak of the rain the night I became homeless. Every insult, every moment of humiliation, resurfaced with vivid, painful clarity. But intertwined with the anger and the hurt was a new, strange sensation, a sense of eerie, profound clarity. This wasn't a random, cruel twist of fate. It felt ordained, purposeful. Fate wasn't just random, it was deeply, undeniably poetic. It was setting a stage, forcing a confrontation not between two men, but between the people we were then and the people we had become. I wasn't driving toward a hospital. I was driving toward the closing of a circle, toward a moment of reckoning that would define me far more than any business success ever could. The hum of the car's engine was the only sound, a steady drone accompanying the silent, emotional preparation for what I would find in that room. Pushing open the door to room 304 felt like crossing a threshold into another dimension, one where time had folded in on itself. The air was antiseptic and still, punctuated only by the rhythmic electronic beeping of a heart monitor. And there, in the center of it all, lay Robert. The man who had once seemed so large, so formidable, a giant whose disapproval could shake my world, was now reduced to a fragile outline beneath crisp white sheets. His skin was a pale, waxy yellow, his face gaunt and lined with pain. Tubes snaked from his arms, connected to bags of clear fluid that hung like strange fruit from a metal pole. When his eyes, clouded with sickness and medication, focused on me standing in the doorway, they widened in a mixture of shock, confusion, and a deep, profound shame. He tried to speak, his dry lips struggling to form the words. "Daniel," he rasped, his voice a thin, broken whisper, stripped of all its former power. You came." Those two words held a universe of unspoken questions. They held the disbelief that I would even consider it, the humiliation of being seen in this state by the man he had cast out, and a flicker of desperate, vulnerable hope. I stood just inside the room, the door sighing shut behind me, and in that moment, the past and the present collided. The giant was felled, not by me, but by time and frailty, and I was the one standing strong. A doctor in a white coat entered the room shortly after, her demeanor efficient and calm. She held a clipboard. "Mr. Reed, I'm Dr. Evans. We spoke on the phone." She glanced at Robert, then back at me. "We need to begin hemodialysis immediately. Robert is stable for now, but his condition is critical. The treatment requires your authorization as the listed guarantor." She held out the clipboard, a pen clipped to the top. The forms were a blur of medical jargon and legal terms, but the bottom line was starkly clear. My signature would set in motion the machinery that would keep him alive. I looked from the papers to Robert. His eyes were closed, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the silent, agonizing wait for my verdict. This was the moment. This was the power he had once wielded over me, the power to grant or deny a future. I could have walked away. The poetic justice would have been complete. But as I stood there, I realized that revenge would have made me a smaller version of the man he once was. I picked up the pen. It felt familiar in my hand, the same hand that now signed paychecks. My hand didn't shake. There was no hesitation, no dramatic pause. With a calm I felt to my core, I looked at the doctor and said, "Yes, I'll sign, he's family." The words were simple, but in that room they were seismic. I wasn't doing it for him, not entirely. I was doing it for the man I had chosen to become. After I signed the papers and the doctor left to make arrangements, a heavy quiet returned to the room, broken only by the relentless beeping of the monitor. Robert turned his head slowly on the pillow, his movements weak and labored. He looked at me, his eyes searching my face, trying to reconcile the man I was now with the one he remembered. The confusion and shame were still there, but now they were mixed with a dawning, bewildered gratitude. "Why?" He whispered, the single word laden with the weight of our entire history. "After everything I said, everything I did, why would you help me?" I held his gaze, the anger I had carried for so long finally quiet, replaced by a deep, settled certainty. I didn't say it to shame him. I didn't say it with pride. I said it softly, as a simple statement of a truth I had earned. "Because," I said, my voice steady and clear in the sterile air, "a real man provides. He provides stability, he provides compassion, he provides a chance, even when no one believes he can, and even for those who never believed in him." The words hung between us, not as an insult, but as a definition. I was defining my own manhood, not by wealth or power, but by the strength of my character in this moment. I was providing the very thing he had declared me incapable of, and in doing so, I was finally, completely, free from his judgment. The impact of my words settled over him not like a blow, but like a gentle, devastating rain. He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes glistening in the dim hospital light, and then a single tear escaped, tracing a slow path down his weathered cheek. It was followed by another, and then he was weeping quietly, his shoulders shaking with silent, ragged sobs he didn't have the strength to vocalize. He turned his face away from me, toward the blank wall, in a final, futile attempt to hide his utter vulnerability. This was the complete and total dissolution of the man he had been. The tears weren't just for the sickness or the fear. They were for the years of arrogance, for the bridges he had burned, for the profound misjudgment that had led him to this moment of absolute dependence on the son-in-law he had thrown away. For the first time in our known history, he was not the one in control. And I, standing by his bedside, was not the one seeking his approval, begging for a scrap of validation. The dynamic was forever inverted. I didn't offer empty words of comfort. I didn't pat his hand. I simply stood as a quiet, steady presence, allowing him the dignity of his breakdown, allowing him to feel the full, crushing weight of his regret and my unearned grace. When the nurse came to wheel him away for his first dialysis treatment, he was still weeping, a broken king being led from his ruined castle. After they wheeled Robert away, I was left alone in the stark, impersonal silence of the waiting room. The plastic chairs were hard and unwelcoming, the air thick with the silent anxiety of other families waiting for their own life-altering news. The rhythmic beeping from other rooms was a constant, haunting reminder of fragility. I sat there, surrounded by strangers and their private fears, and let the memories wash over me, no longer as sharp, painful stabs, but as scenes from a story that had already been written. I saw the dining table, the tossed loan papers, the rain-soaked street. But now, viewed from this new vantage point, they felt distant, like exhibits in a museum of a life I had outgrown. The rain outside began to tap gently against the large window, a soft, percussive rhythm that was eerily familiar. It was the same rhythm from the night I left my old home, the same sound that had been the soundtrack to my rock bottom. But tonight, it sounded different. It wasn't a sound of cold abandonment. It was a sound of cleansing, of a cycle completing itself. I wasn't waiting for anything from Robert anymore. I wasn't waiting for an apology or for him to see me. I was just waiting, as a man who had done what he felt was right, regardless of the past. In that quiet, liminal space, the last remnants of my anger dissolved, leaving behind a quiet, weary, but profound sense of peace. I must have dozed off in the uncomfortable chair because the touch on my shoulder startled me awake. It was Dr. Evans. "Mr. Reed," she said, her face softened by a small, tired smile. "The first session is complete. He's stable. He's resting. He'll need ongoing treatment, but he's out of immediate danger." She paused, looking at me with a respect that felt unearned yet deeply affirming. "You saved his life tonight. Your quick authorization made all the difference." I exhaled slowly, a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 2 years, The weight of her words was immense, but I shook my head gently. "No," I whispered, my voice rough with fatigue and emotion. "I didn't save him." I looked toward the hallway that led to the recovery rooms, where the man who had tried to break me was now sleeping, his life extended by my hand. "I just gave him back what he once took from me," I said to the doctor, but really to myself. A chance. He had taken my chance at a marriage, my chance at dignity, my chance at a future with the family I had chosen. Tonight, I had given him a chance at life, not because he deserved it, but because I was capable of giving it. That was the real victory, not his survival, but my capacity for grace. He was discharged from the hospital 2 weeks later, weaker, humbler, a man physically and emotionally diminished. I arranged for a home health aide and ensured his medical bills were covered through the company's health plan, a silent administration of care that required no conversation. A few days after he was settled at home, my phone rang. It was him. His voice was still weak but clearer. "Daniel," he began, and I could hear the immense effort it took. Would you come by?" I went. He was in an armchair by the window, a blanket over his legs. He didn't look at me at first, his gaze fixed on the world outside. "I misjudged you," he said, the words seeming to cost him a great deal. "I saw your struggle as weakness. I was wrong." He finally turned his head, and his eyes, though tired, were clear. "What you did and what you've become, you became more of a man than I ever was." It wasn't a grand speech. It was a simple, stark admission. The thank you wasn't for the money or the medical care. It was an acknowledgement of my character. It was the validation I had once craved so desperately, now arriving when I no longer needed it. I didn't feel triumph hearing it. I felt a quiet sadness for the years lost to his pride, and a sense of closure for the boy who had once wilted under his scorn. I listened to his words, this long-awaited admission, and let them settle. There was no joy in it, only a profound sense of a story ending. I smiled, but it was a faint, wistful thing, touched by the sadness of all that had been broken and could never be fully repaired. "You taught me something important, Robert," I said, my voice calm and even. "You taught me how it feels to be abandoned, to have a door closed in your face when you're at your most vulnerable." I met his gaze, seeing the flicker of pain in his eyes. "So," I continued, "I learned how to never abandon anyone again, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." That was the core of my journey. His cruelty had been the lesson in what not to be. My response to his crisis was the final exam, and I had passed. This wasn't about forgiveness, not in the warm, fuzzy sense. It was about understanding that his actions had indirectly forged my greatest strength, my resilience and my capacity for empathy. The chapter of our conflict was closed, not with a bang, but with this quiet, painful, necessary understanding. We would never be father and son, but we would no longer be predator and prey. Robert recovered slowly. The dialysis became a part of his life, a thrice-weekly reminder of his mortality and my intervention. We didn't become close. There were no family dinners, no heartfelt reunions. The history was too heavy, the wounds too deep for that kind of easy resolution. Instead, we became quiet. Our interactions were limited to brief, practical phone calls about his care or his finances. When we did see each other, the air was not filled with the old tension, but with a mutual, unspoken understanding. We were two men bound together not by affection, but by a series of painful, life-altering lessons that hurt too much to ever speak of aloud. He had learned the cost of his pride. I had learned the strength that can be born from humiliation. There was a strange, fragile peace in that silence. It was the peace of a battle that was finally, truly over, with no victors and no vanquished, only two survivors on opposite sides of a field, acknowledging the war had ended. Years later, I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window of my corner office, watching the city ignite with the evening's lights. My company, Reed Logistics, was a recognized name, a testament to the power of a good idea and relentless grit. My life had healed in ways I hadn't thought possible. Sarah and I had found a quiet, distant friendship, both of us having moved on to build different lives. The sharp pain of that time was a faded scar. As I looked down at the bustling port in the distance, I could see the tiny lights of the ships being guided safely into harbor by my company's tracking systems. The low, steady hum of the servers in the room behind me, the very machines I had once feared for their complex, error-prone code, was now a comforting sound. It was the sound of provision. It was the sound of stability I had built from nothing. I provided for my employees. I provided for my clients. And in the most unexpected twist, I had provided a second chance for the man who said I never could. The circle was not just closed, it was complete. Every hum of the machines, every light on the horizon reminded me of the truth I now lived every day. I provided. Not in the narrow, financial way he had once defined it, but in every way that truly mattered, with strength, with compassion, and with a quiet, unshakable grace. Because on Karma Diaries, the ones they call not man enough always become the strength others depend on.